Well, hello everybody. This is our Service Design Dallas April session. We are very excited to have you join us today. We're going to be doing a book review, so to speak, with three authors from Norway and Sweden. So we're excited about having them, and it's a bit late for them. So we're going to try to go through some very quick house cleaning, so to speak, and talk about who we are, what we do, and starting with thanking our sponsor. Slalom has been sponsoring us for several years now, as well as Precocity, who is allowing us to have those virtual calls all over the world. So we thank you for joining us from the US, Asia, Europe, quite a few people from all over the world today. So we're very excited to have you, and we hope that you enjoyed this session with our three wonderful authors. Very quick reminder, I am Greg Clatworthy and I work for Slalom as well. Brandon, Robin, and Brenda are also our three other Service Design Dallas members who are going to be helping us today kind of moderate the chat. If you have any questions for the author, they will do a really good job at moderating those and asking the authors at the end of the session what your questions are. So as again, I always want to be letting you know that this is recorded. So if you have missed a session, I think we have about 30 or 40 now over the past 4 years, definitely go to our YouTube channel and check out the past speakers. We have a lot of different topics around futurism, blueprinting, quant research. So anything that touches service design, we have tried to bring you the foremost people in the space who can definitely bring that knowledge and help you do better design work at your clients or your current work. As we were just saying, if you have a specific question, you can definitely be engaged in a chat, just talk to each other. Absolutely, we're used to it and definitely have a good time doing so. If you have a specific question for one of our three guests, definitely let Brandon and Robin and Brenda know about this. Kind of like this is a specific question for Stefan, for example, so we can keep track of that and we can ask them your question at the end of the session in a Q&A format, if you will. So make sure you make that obvious to us that you actually have a specific question for one of the authors. So obviously we love service design books. We're big fans of that. And we have over the past several years had some wonderful authors who joined us and told us about their books. If you want to take a look at the first book we had was Service Design Thinking and Mark Stigdorn. If you want to look at the April 2020 session, been 4 years now, definitely take a look at his video on YouTube. We also had Service Design Doing with both Adam and Mark as well. We also had the lovely Erica Hall a couple of times actually talking about research, and she had multiple books. Obviously, we talked about conversationalists and just enough research. We also had the wonderful Andy Pauline talking to us about his service design book. All those books are quote-unquote textbooks, and they are basically seen in the world as the textbooks of service design. We also had Jim Kalbach that gave us the honor to talk to us about his Mapping Experiences book. So we have reviewed a lot of design books, and today we're very happy to bring you a brand new book that was published, I believe, in December last year, so a brand new book. And today we're going to be talking about the materials of service design. So obviously as designers, we use a lot of those materials from a post-it, paper, pencil, all those things we use, all the tools we use. And today we're going to be taking a look at a bit of a novel approach of what the authors looked at those materials of service design. What do we use every day to do our job? So usually we have the materials and the tangibles, right? So it could be an iPad, it could be a post-it, it could be a piece of paper, it could be a lot of different digital artifacts that we use, prototyping. Those are the materials, the tangibles, tools that we use every day to do our work. But the author decided to take another look at that. So what are the immaterials and the intangibles that we are using every day in our work, such as conversation, for example? So all of us every day spend 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours in conversations, and we definitely are using that as a material to get to that service design experience. Same as behavior, we definitely are looking at behaviors of the users, the stakeholders, and to modifying and manipulating the behavior to actually get the better experience. Obviously, data is a very big material we use, whether qualitative or quantitative. We use data a lot to have some data-driven decisions in our experiences, but so are policies, so is culture, and obviously organizations. So today we're going to have a bit of a different look at those things that we use every day in our job. And it's a very novel look at looking at the things we use every day that may not be as simple as a pen or as in this case, a knife or a pencil. So if you had a chance, I believe that Brenda is going to put the link to the book. If you're in the US, we recommend to go to the publisher directly because I believe it is sold out on Amazon. But if you do want to have a very, very quick access to that, you can actually purchase the book as an ebook, I believe, on the Google Play Store, and you can actually get this lovely book for, I believe, $30 immediately. So definitely a great book to have, beautiful book, great cover, beautiful design. And we're going to talk to the authors today about their thoughts and intent and what's been happening in their life since. So today I want to welcome Simon, Stefan, and Johan. Simon Clatworthy is a design professor from the Oslo School of Architecture and Design in Norway. He is today joining us from Copenhagen. Stefan and Johan both work at the Linköping University in Sweden. Stefan is a design professor and Johan is the assistant design professor. And we will have a chance to talk to all three of them. And they're going to answer some questions from us. And if you want to have some more specific questions for each one of them, definitely let us know and we'll just forward those questions for you. If you don't mind, and this is kind of like any order, Simon, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you get to be with Stefan and Johan to write this book about service design?
Oh, this is a long story. I'm Simon Clatworthy. I'm professor of design. I've been teaching service design at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. And we have actually our 20-year anniversary this year. We started teaching service design masters 20 years ago. So we're going to be celebrating that in October, I think. And we've developed a service design course and we've developed service design research. And I kind of came a bit late to academia. So my PhD is from around 2010, which is in service design. And that was where I kind of got interested in materials. And I arranged one of the first research conferences together with Stefan and Johan and several other people, the ServDes research conferences. And that's how we kind of got together as a group and started talking about materials, amongst other things.
Cool, very good. Stefan, if you don't mind introducing yourself for the attendees.
So I'm Stefan Holmlid. I'm professor of design at Linköping University in Sweden. It's in the south of Sweden. And I guess Simon pretty much summed up the way we started working together, at least, right? And we've been, on and off, we've been doing different things together. I started doing service design somewhere around 2003 or something. And one of the first things I started doing was looking at, the equivalent to white space or counterform in services, which is of course very materially oriented because the only things that can be counterform is something you can see or feel or hear, but something that has to do with the senses.
Very cool. Johan Blomkvist, so tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Johan Blomkvist. I also work at Linköping University. I have been interested in service design for a long time. I started in 2008, I think, with my PhD, maybe 2009, I don't remember. And Stefan was actually my supervisor. So he's been sort of helping me along in my discovery of this topic and this thing. And I presented my PhD thesis in 2014. It takes a long time in Sweden to finish your PhDs. Actually the issue of materiality was part of why I chose to focus on what I focused on in my PhD studies, which was prototyping and, thinking about what it means to prototype something with such a big part being intangible and how we can actually approach that. So yeah, the issue of materiality has been following me for a long time. And I actually did look at the first thing that we did together around this. And I if I'm not mistaken, I think it's now the 10-year anniversary for the first attempt at writing about the materiality of service design. So reason to celebrate.
Welcome all three of you. Now let's dig in and start looking into this great book. It's very new way of looking at it. Let me see. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and just you guys can take turn. Let me know who wants to speak first. A very high level question. If you actually want to dig deeper into each question, let me know. First question is, let's just say for Simon, what inspired you to look into the concept of intangible materials, and how did you define these materials in the book? Who wants to take this one? Simon,
that's a great question. Greg, thanks. I think one of the things that as I said, I came late to academia, and as part of my PhD, I was looking at thinking about design, and design commonly in Scandinavia is called formgivning, which is like giving form to things. And it made me think, what are we actually giving form to as designers? What are we actually forming? Because it's easier in terms of product design, what we're forming, but in terms of service design, it's a good question, what are we forming? And I started thinking about that, and as part of my research, I read the well-known researcher Donald Schoen, who's written about design as being a conversation with materials. And that kind of connected this up to me. It's like, what are the materials that we're forming in service design? And that got me thinking. And to me, one of the first ones immediately was touch points as a material. Like, we form the touch points, and we form the interactions, and we place them along a journey, for example, and we choose them. And I wrote a little bit about that, and that got me talking to Stefan and Johan, and that's where we kind of got going. So I don't know if you want to chip in, Johan, with like how you came to this material thing, and I can go back to the definitions, because there's some interesting things about definitions of material that I think are worth talking about.
Yeah, well, I would actually just like to talk about how this came about, I think, because it's not only us, it's not only me, Stefan, and Simon that contributed to the book. A big part of the book is, of course, all the other contributing authors. So we asked people around us in academia, but also in practice, to suggest, to pitch materials of service design. And we asked them to send in or to pitch a material that they thought were, the main material or the most important material for service design. And we didn't specify that it should be intangible. I think now that you mention it, Greg, maybe all of the materials are actually intangible to some extent, but we also include clay, for instance. So they also included a lot of other materials. So I just wanted to make sure that we mention that. Like I said, I think the process actually started when I was doing my postdoc, when I was working with Simon in Norway. And we started talking about the issue of materiality in service design. And I think I was really inspired by what Simon was thinking about this. And I knew that Stefan had also been working a lot with it. So yeah, it was a perfect storm of interest and nerdiness, I think.
Nerdiness, really.
Yeah.
It's a really nerdy book. I mean, we decided, actually, we wrote a paper at a conference, and we were asked if we wanted to write an article based on that. And then we decided, no, we'd like to get really nerdy and nerd about this for a book. And that's kind of the history of, and we invited a lot of well-known people to suggest and pitch their favorite materials or important materials. And that's kind of how it came about. And we've really enjoyed nerding together, I think.
Okay. So obviously we talked a lot about the intangible. And so can you please tell us more about how you came to define materials? Because once you go down that road, obviously anything is game, right? So for example, I personally was not say surprised per se, but like we did a lot of technology, for example, right? We're constantly being asked about infusing or inserting like AI currently, right? So it is definitely something that we use as a material to craft those experiences. And obviously that book could be 3 times as big if you actually went through all those materials around culture, for example, those like very like soft and squishy ideas. So how did you narrow it down to, I believe the 15 or 16 materials actually made into the book? And which one did you wish you could have included in the book and you didn't for whatever reason?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I'd like to kind of nerd a little bit about the definitions, if that's okay, because as like academics, when you start nerding, the first thing you do is look at definitions, and the definitions opened up some interesting directions for us. And if I could just kind of go through those, because they're kind of important in terms of how we view materials. But the first one is fairly clear. It's like material is something that you can form, or something that it is made out of, which is something it is composed of. And that's the kind of traditional view you might have about materials. But then there's another one, which is something, material qualities that give uniqueness to something, like a soft material, a warm material, a hard material. And that kind of, we're getting some interesting people coming in on here. And that gave us some views of what gives a service uniqueness, and how do you form that? So that's another kind of direction to come in. It's not like the physical forming things, but more the, what you'd say, what gives uniqueness or differentiation in the market? What materials would give that? And then there's another definition, which is material that is made the object of study, like study materials. If you're starting a course, you have study materials. And that gave us an opening into what materials should you be studying? What materials should a course be comprised of? If you're a consultancy, what are the key materials you want to be good at forming, for example? So there's materials like that. And then the final one, which I quite like, is like the magician's materials or the comedian's materials, which are kind of the toolbox. What have you got in your toolbox? What does your show consist of? And as designers, I think we need to be aware of these. So that was a kind of start point, as to explore it in a very broad way, and then to invite people in. And like you say, the book could be a whole library of things. AI, for example, are things that we'd like to have there. The experience, in many ways, we're forming the experience. There's conversations, organizations, and we're in the process of putting up a companion website to try and create an online material library, because there are material libraries in architecture, product design, and we think it'd be really nice to have material library in interaction design. So Stefan, Johan, and I are kind of thrashing that out now, of how people can pitch materials, and we can put them up, and it become a living library of things. So that's the kind of history and the view we're taking, and I think it's good. It's a good approach to take these different definitions and think, what is my own kind of toolbox of materials?
Cool.
And
we didn't really choose materials. We had a process where we nerded around materials together with others, and then they were self-selecting whether they wanted to contribute to the book or not.
Okay, very cool. So if you want, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper, and I have my second question here, which we can definitely dive into a bit deeper. So like, how do you see the relationship between the tangible that I just described and the intangible materials evolve, and how does your book address this duality? So we kind of like touch up a little bit on that.
So I mean that's one of those things we kind of nerded about, I believe. And we can talk about this as a duality or a conceptualization between differences or something like that. But the more we worked with the book and talked about it and tried to figure out what is this thing, what do we mean, what does it entail, these materials of service design, we kind of realized that it's more like a multiplicity. Each material is both at the same time. And probably other things too at the same time. And in some sense, we're doing our best to avoid addressing this duality in itself, right? Probably failing as much as we try. But one part of the book where this is maybe most obvious is in part 3, chapter 3, the hyper material chapter, as we call it. So first of all, I mean, there is the fact that in service design, we use a lot of representations, right? They're used to give access to material that we can manipulate physically, or in some sense at least. And those are material manifestations of something intangible, or something conceptual, maybe I should say. And one of those really more detailed attempts within the hypermaterial chapter is the idea about proxy materials. So those are materials that we engage with in order to form other materials. For example, the material conversations, we can manipulate that and form that and work with that a lot and engage with that for the purpose of forming thinking with the people that we collaborate or conversing with or making conversations through. And the intention behind forming thinking may, for example, be to give shape to an organization, to give possibilities within an organization to maybe work more with design or work more with person-centered care or whatever. So I think that's the way we've been handling this multiplicity or the duality or whatever, right? It's both tangible and intangible at the same time, and there are layers to this that makes it even more, in some sense, complex, but also more handleable at the same time. And in the end, of course, I mean, everything that exists, everything we do has to be manifested in the physical world. Otherwise, it doesn't exist, right? So it's an action that someone is doing. It's a relationship that we're setting up or whatever, and that exists in the real world or in the physical world. So that's also something that kind of creates this maybe tension, duality between tangibility and intangibility.
Simon, do you have anything to talk about duality between tangible and intangible?
Well, I think one of the things that I've been fascinated by in this, and I kind of maybe going off a little bit in a tangent, but is really Johan's area, which is representation of how service designers are using these proxy materials to represent things. And I'm kind of a bit jealous that Stefan had this chapter suggesting time as a material, because I would love to have time. I would love to have had the time one. But we kind of discussed that, like, through representation, you're very often representing future states, future situations. So in many ways, you could say the service designer is a time traveler on behalf of a project team. So by making the future tangible through visualizations or representations, you're looking into the future. You're making the future, evidencing the future now, which I think is a really key element of forming in service design. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So if it's okay, I'm going to actually go a bit more in detail, because it's been very high level up to now. So now, if you don't mind, let's go and actually see if we can come some. So can you elaborate on some key material in service design in the book, such as social structure, for example, thinking, culture, organization, conversation? We talked about data a little bit already, but how can you give us some more example of those key materials in more concrete example? And also how does understanding of those materials contribute to shaping the service design practice? This is always a way for us to move forward and to add more tools. In this case, those tools could be conversations, right? So give us a bit more about some of those key materials. Maybe Johan.
Yeah, I can try that. And Simon seems eager to also say something about it. Well, first of all, I must once again emphasize, like, we had a lot of contributing authors, and most of the materials in the material library, most of the materials you mention here were actually written by other than us, and probably they are the best to talk about those materials. And we only tried to sort of make them be as explicit as possible, and also, of course, to talk as much as possible about the relevance of their materials for service design and for service design practice. So what does it actually mean then? How is this material shaped as part of a design process? what does it mean to try and shape it, and how do you work with those with the material that you're suggesting? And I think the best way to understand that is actually to read the chapters themselves and read about those materials, because they do a much better job than I would do at describing them. But we did, of course, also think about how, and try to make sense of how the materials, for instance, relate to each other, and in terms of things such as feedback and what feedback looks like in the different materials. So you mentioned things such as organizations, thinking, social structures. I mean, the feedback that you get, like when you're able to actually see the effect of your actions, when the effect of your actions become visible in the materials, it takes a long time before you can notice that. And that's one thing that we thought was interesting about that kind of material. And it's also, and we talk about that it's difficult sometimes to recognize the change that that you're responsible for, so to say. Like you may have done something with a very clear purpose, and it looks like something during design, but then in the actual service, it looks like something completely different, or you're not sure if that was the intended effect, for instance. And change can also be facilitated by other decisions or changes made by other actors in a service, right? So we think that is something that, as a service designer, you need to be able to train and practice and learn about. Like, how do you actually identify change as a result of your actions when the materials sometimes do not give direct feedback in the way that, I don't know, chiseling a piece of wood or something like that would actually do. So that is one important aspect in understanding that, I think. And so that's something that we've talked a lot about. But I know that, Stefan, you're actually the author behind Time that Simon mentioned. Maybe you want to say something specific then about time.
Time. I can say something specific about time. And I think this, well, it doesn't matter, by the way, but time is an elusive concept, right? And it's also material that hasn't really received the attention it deserves. In many senses, both in service design and in my former field, interaction design. But now we're talking service design. So in many cases, time is seen as the passing of time, some chronological time, or chronos, right? A quantitative idea of time with a timeline, a focus on durations, and activities have durations, etc., right? At the same time, many of the representations we use in service design, they totally ignore this exactness of this way of thinking about time. Chronos is a super exact way of thinking about time. We have seconds, minutes, years, right? Leap years, leap seconds. And you can see this, right? Very few customer journey maps are true to scale when it comes to the passing of time. Not even, the more modeling kind of representation, such as a service blueprint does this very well. You add maybe a time stamp or something, right? But it's very, very seldom true to scale. So most representations takes a value perspective, even though they try to have this chronological way of representing and saying that this is what time is like. So chronological time is a material that we need to understand how it works, what it means, and how we can represent it, how we can work with it in prototyping. Because if we're prototyping something that is, going to the doctors and getting a scan for potential cancer, then you will be waiting for a week, right? But how do you prototype waiting for a week? That's really, really difficult. So there is also another way of thinking about time that is called, it's called kairos time. And it's the qualitative way of thinking about time, or approaching time. It's about the right time, timing, the opportune time. And probably without knowing it, most service designers rely on actually on this way of thinking about time, even though we try to cram it into this chronological way of thinking. So kairos, then it relates to, in what order is it sensible to do certain actions, and how far apart should they be. It relates to the perception of rhythm, and whether something feels as if it happens too fast or too slow. So time in this sense definitely shapes service design practice. It's part of the very core of what service design practice is dealing with, from the very abstract to the representations and conceptualizations, all the way down to the services as they are performed. And in order to be able to work with this, we need to understand both these different ways of thinking about time, chronos and kairos, and we need to be able to figure out how our other ways of working, our representations, our relations, how they actually feed into this, and how we can use those other ways of working to work with this material. Because time is one of those materials that chronological time we can never work with directly, because time passes whatever we do, right? So forming chronological time is really difficult, but forming kairos time is actually much easier in some sense. We can work with this conception and work with forming. So keeping this in mind and just knowing time as a material in these different senses I think is super important as a service designer.
Very good, thank you. Simon, I believe you had something to add at the beginning. Do you have anything to add around this question?
Yeah, I think I've already mentioned touch points, because I think for me, touch points are one of the core materials of service design, because it's relating to the choice and the position and the design of the touch point. But one of the ones it's one of my kind of favorite ones, I think, is culture, which Claire Dennington and I wrote, which is designers designing culture. And in this way, in this context, kind of popular culture. Now, I'm old enough to remember when the first Jonathan Ive designed iMacs came around. How many, put your hands up, those who kind of remember the Jonathan Ive iMacs, which were kind of lozenge colored, like fruit sweets with blues and reds and all kinds of colors. Now, they were a great success, and they were a great success because in many ways, Jonathan Ive, as a designer, read the spirit of the times, like the zeitgeist, which is a phrase used in product design. It's like understanding the culture of the time and making something that fits really well. And one of the things I think we're lacking in service design is this discussion about popular culture and what you could call it trends, of like what trends are now important and how can they be used as a material in service design. But the Jonathan Ive's iMac, if you remember that time, it was a kind of horrible follow-on period where everything in people's kitchens became this kind of translucent plastic, which you kind of see in garage sales and yard sales these days. There's like this whole period. So his design influenced culture afterwards. And the same with the Alessi products, which were very influenced by organic forms and people, Philip Stark. So designer is actually a former of culture, is also formed by culture. And I think this is a dialogue that we're not really having much in service design. How much are we aware of the trends that can be a start point for designing? And so to me, culture is a really important material, but it's quite overlooked.
So I think it's going to lead me to my next question, which is kind of like, could you share some examples from your book that illustrate how understanding manipulating service design materials can lead to innovative and effective design solution, right? Because we're not just listing materials for the sake of listing materials. Kind of like, how can we use culture and thinking conversation to actually lead to a different output?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in on that one as well, because the goal of the book was not really to give so many case studies of how a material was being used, but part of each material description, the authors, the guest authors and ourselves were talking about how we form the material and the consequences of forming the material. So if I take Conversations, for example, that's written by Jonathan Rom, a colleague of mine. And it might seem at first like an unusual material to think of designers forming conversations, but he did some quite fundamental research. And he was working with embedded labs in healthcare. Now, I just need to say a little bit about embedded labs. It's sometimes healthcare have their own internal labs, and sometimes design studios have a lab for doing innovation. But the embedded lab is where a service design group go into an organization, into a hospital, for example, and create a lab for making change, transforming elements of the service, and it's placed in a visual place. And he, as part of his work, studied what conversations were had in the lab over time. And he found some really interesting things that, like, for example, at the beginning, there's a lot of scoping questions. The first part of the double diamond is very much strategic conversations, trying to understand the strategic role of the interventions that are wanted. And then they become more operational as time goes on, more tactical maybe. And he also identified a specific kind of design conversation, which was meaning conversations, trying to understand the deeper meaning behind some decisions being made, or stimulating a discussion with the organization about the meaning behind things, especially in healthcare. What is it? What's the deeper meaning that you're trying to achieve by this transformation? And as time goes on, the conversations become very operational in terms of detailed design questions, and just understanding what kind of questions you should ask at which times and which ones have the biggest effect is a really good way of approaching a project, of sitting down and thinking, okay, what questions do we need to ask now? Have we had the right strategic conversations to be able to enable us to go forward? And do we need to create some design artifacts to help stimulate some new strategic conversations, for example? So using material in that focus actually helped the project Jonathan had to go faster and better and deeper at the right places. So that's a kind of example where I think an unusual material for many people, conversations, is actually something the service designer can explicitly form, and how it can have a consequence.
Thank you, Simon. Johan or Stefan, do you have anything to add to Simon's answer?
Yeah, I mean, let's add a material at the other end of the spectrum then, right? So clay, also called tangible catalyst in the book, but clay is described by Matilda Legeby, a designer, a professional designer working in mainly in policy development projects. And clay here was used in one of those projects with when we had a lot of loan-coming migrant youth to Sweden or to Scandinavia. And clay here was used in the projects with all the organizations that were taking care of these loan-coming young people, and with these young people. And it gave the participants, and especially the organizations, anchoring into who the project was for. The project was not for the organizations. The project was for those people coming here, and for what purpose this cooperative project was set up. So these clay, working with the clay, gave these possibilities to anchor the project and the people in the project. And so the goal was to challenge and change legislation, actually, which was also successful. So the legislation for loan-coming youth was changed after this project. So the different organizations were able to be activated much earlier and in a more, let's call it more confident or relevant way than they had been before. They had almost had to be activists in the way they had been working. But suddenly they were part of something that actually made it possible for them to act. So in this case, then clay, the material clay being modeled not necessarily by professional designers, but also by professional designers, was used as a way of changing legislation.
Cool. Johan, do you have anything to add?
Not necessarily about that aspect of the materials, no.
Let's move on to my last question. Actually, there's going to be a lot more like academic, I would say. In what ways do you envision your book contributing to the evolution of education within the field of service design, and how might it impact practitioners, leaders, students, and academics in related disciplines such as marketing and innovation? So this idea of materials, how do you foresee that, infusing other practices or other academics? Do you see other teachers of service design kind of like embracing that idea of intangible materials? What is your vision for your book in terms of like having an impact on other academics and students?
Yeah, so maybe I can start with that one instead. I think that the materials are already important, and I think this material library might be important for perhaps all of those target audiences. Specifically, I think because we do not have a good understanding at the moment of what the material of service design is, at least not from a design perspective specifically. So from my point of view, at least, I feel like the material of service have been sort of defined and described a lot in neighboring disciplines, academically, at least in service management and marketing. And that has sort of redefined or defined what service is in those disciplines, but also for service design. And service design has been doing a lot of adaptations and, questioning what we're doing and working with, and using the version suggested in service marketing, perhaps, and the definition of materiality. So a lot has been done to think about, okay, so what does service dominant logic mean for services? Or what does value co-creation mean for services and service design and resource integration and things like that? And they are important aspects, important issues, things to consider and take into account. But we sort of feel, or I feel at least, that this is not the first, but one of the first attempts to actually define service as a design material. The tangible and the intangible aspects, like this hypermateriality thing that we have suggested, or the way to think about it as a hypermaterial. And I think that in itself means that it's something to take into account and think about when you're designing courses in service design. Perhaps as a practitioner, it's something that can open your horizons, or make you aware of other types of design, other materials that you could be considering that you maybe are not aware of or not considering already as part of the mix of materials that you can work with as a service designer. So in that sense, I think the book or the materials can also help you sort of broaden your perspective on service design, and maybe give some inspiration about what you could be doing. Like I said, we've put quite a lot of emphasis in making the materials not only a suggestion for material, but also what does it mean to shape the material? How can you sort of work with this material as part of a design process? Not management process or anything like that, but a design process specifically. And I think that is one of the strongest points of the book.
Yeah, and I think your book, opens a brand new dimension to how to handle this, right? So I think it was interesting because it's obviously very difficult to define. Since the beginning, you asked 30 designers definition, you have 35 definitions, right? So I think including this very service design as a whole is very squishy, right? It does a lot of things. It can do everything, but not everything. So I think it's really helpful for us to kind of stop thinking in terms of the artifacts of service design, but also start considering the activities, right? Like a conversation can actually have a tremendous amount of power. And we have a lot of people actually get very myopic onto the blueprint, right? A blueprint. But it's really the output of a lot of conversations, a lot of interviews. Now, all those immaterial things actually make service design so difficult to sell as well and to understand. I think that you just open the door to kind of like have a bigger understanding and kind of like, this is why it's so hard to do. This is why it's so hard to define. This is why it's so hard to sell, because all those things are just really intangible and immaterial, and therefore they don't really translate very well into like a price tag or a number of weeks or something. That's going to be much easier to have a finite definition around, UX or UI or whatever. But Switzerland definitely has that, timely, sensation to it. I want to give a chance to either Simon or Stefan to also answer how this new door you have opened could be influential to the way design is being taught in other practices. I know I see a couple of teachers in the chat who have questions for you. But maybe before we actually open the chat to some questions, maybe Simon and Stefan, you want to finish on this one.
Yeah, I can chip in. I will just say that Johan said it all, right? This is a design perspective, and that's really important. We don't see that in management. We don't see that in service operations. So just starting this, because that's also something, right? This is a start at least in book form and in the material library ID that we have. We've all of us that have been in service design, we've been working with these materials. It's just that we maybe haven't been articulating them as materials in the public. And now it's out there, and it's really difficult to undo.
Can I jump in a little bit? Because I think we've been planning some new courses at the university and in service design, redeveloping the course. And one of the things we've been thinking about is if we don't know which materials we're forming, then it's going to be very difficult to teach service design. And it's the same if you're a practitioner. If you don't know materials that you're forming, then it must be very difficult to define yourself and your identity as a designer. So I think we're hopefully taking this a little bit back to design and the material approach of design and forming, which was a key word here. And I think it allows us to think a course has a certain space or volume for content, and we've got to place things in there that have maximum effect. And really placing the right materials in there helps you define the future service designers that will coming out from university. And that means, for example, we're discussing at our school, which is an architecture and design school, but data and AI, for example, we're not very good at that. And it's an important material. We've become aware it's a really important material, and we have to put it in there. So that's changing our curriculum and changing the designers that will be coming out of the school. So I think that's a really central part of this, is it helps define you as an individual designer, helps you define you as an organization. So you can market yourselves of like, these are the kind of materials we focus on, whereas others maybe focus on other things. And as an educational institution, and I think we've lacked that. And I think it's very nice to see it as this way of saying, maybe in the future, will people say, I'm this kind of service designer, and mention some of the materials that they work with.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, we're starting to see some like more mature organizations actually have multiple levels or multiple dimensions of service designers. Some of them have like one person that covers all the diamonds, so to speak. And some of them definitely specialize in prototyping, ideation. So we're getting into this phase, absolutely. We have a few moments. I want to be respectful of your time. I know it's late in Norway and Sweden. We're going to switch to some questions from the attendees, if you don't mind. I'm going to let Brendan and Robin ask you some direct questions, if it's okay with you.
Hey guys, this is coming from Seb, and Seb asks, if I can find it again. Oh, there it is. What, if any, materials did you consider including, but you left out of the book? You may have touched upon it, but just which ones didn't make the cut?
I'm thinking if we actually excluded any material, and we did a lot of work making sure that the contributions had the ingredients we were looking for, and a lot of that was about finding these ways in which you can shape the materials. But I'm struggling to remember any material that we said that no, we shouldn't have this. I know that we had a discussion about experiences or touch points. I think maybe touch points wasn't that much of a discussion, but experience was something that we felt that we needed to have, because otherwise people would just not think that we had done our job correctly. But I don't know, do you have any other suggestions, Stefan? Or Stefan, you're muted.
Sorry, we had a short list that we were partly, because we made a symposium. That's the nerd thing, right? We had a symposium where people pitched their materials. So that's the material authors. And we had kind of a short list based on what those conversations that were during the symposium on potential materials, right? Possibilities that we could develop or not. And so one thing I remember that we didn't actually develop, so we didn't actually exclude it in some sense, because we never thought about including it in some sense, was value. So in what way is value a material or not? So that was one of those that were kind of on the radar, but never actually developed.
It looks like Tanya in the chat is asking about emotion. So obviously, one of the chapters you actually have behavior as one of the material, right? So we definitely get into that sphere of behavior, emotion. So did you consider emotion as being a material of service design that can be obviously manipulated and augmented to create better experiences, or you can stay away from something like emotions and sentiment that could be harder to define?
Maybe I can jump in there. We kind of packaged emotions into experience, designing for experience. We have a chapter, a material being the experience, because I think it's very much the expected experience, the lived experience, and the remembered experience are kind of key things that designers are considering and trying to form, and integrating lots of other materials to try and make those experiences happen. So I think the emotions were packaged in as part of the experience. And I think part of the discussions we've had is that some of the materials we thought covered several areas, like clay as a tangible catalyst. There's lots of tangible materials that we could have written about. But we thought clay was just a good example to kind of summarize those kinds of materials. So some of them are kind of groups. Otherwise, we'd have ended up with an enormous book. And I really want to encourage people to go to the companion website, which will be up and running soon, crossing fingers, or at least submit to Stefan, myself, or Johan suggestions for materials. And we have a template we can send out. It's not very long, but just to get it going, if you can visualize your material, tell a little bit about it, tell about how service designers form it, we'll put it up there on the website, because we want this to be a shared library.
Yeah. And I'm assuming when you actually there's only a few material things that are actually in the book, like clay is one of them. But obviously the idea of clay can be transferred into like wood, for example, right? It's not to be just clay. It's just something you can, it's very pliable, you can move. We could also use like Legos, for example. A lot of people use Legos as a material for workshopping or whatever it is. So I believe, Johan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think Simon already mentioned it, but I just wanted to add then that I had a seminar recently, and I asked the audience then for material suggestions, and I think we got a list of maybe 20 or 30 other materials as well. So there's and I love that. I think that's so great that people are passionate about different materials, and they some are really, champions for their materials, and they want that to be understood as the most important material. And I think it says something about who you are as a designer and what you're focusing on and how you see what you're doing. And I think this can also open up for new ways to understand that, right? To understand what service design is and who you are as a service designer, and trying to make sense perhaps of what you're doing as a service designer.
We discussed before the call, I know the book came out, I think, in December in Sweden, in Europe at least. Have you already had feedback from designers who have purchased your book as like, this is amazing, it's really helped me to do X? Are you already seeing some feedback from people actually like, this is great, I'm not using new materials, or is it still very much like ramping up? Anybody?
Well, Mark from the service design show. If you look him up on Mark Fontaigne, if you look him up on LinkedIn, he reviewed the book, and he was like, it was totally flattering, because it was like, this is going to change service design, and describing it, and he started a very good dialogue. So the comments, as much as his review, is really important, because the comments are also from other designers talking about it. So I think it's something to stimulate feedback. And one of the things I think is when we talk about it to other designers, they get this aha experience of, yes, that's a really good question. And suddenly they start reeling off materials, some of which we have covered, some of which we haven't. But it obviously, I think it strikes a note with designers and brings service design a little bit back to design, to the core of design, in my opinion, which it needs to do.
Very good. Just make sure we have a bit more time for more questions. Brendan or Robin, do you have another question for the authors?
Yeah, there was a follow-up actually to the materials question, but this is sort of the opposite side, not what you excluded, but what are some of the materials that you find were unique to service design, or more specifically, kind of define how service design is different from other disciplines? Or were there?
I mean, that's of course maybe that's the $1 million question in some sense, because it all depends on how you view service design, right? So in another book in Swedish, but it'll build on some of the work that has been done in Oslo by Jostein Vink. I mean, you can think about service design as the design of a service. You can think about design as designing for service, or as designing in service systems. And depending on which kind of perspective you take, there will be different materials that are unique to service, to that way of thinking about service design. So there's this maybe a weird Schoenian kind of back and forth here between your view of what it is, that what kind of designer you are, the materials you're using that are unique to being that way of being a designer, and the way those materials answer back to your view of yourself as a service designer. So that was the professorial "it depends" answer, right? But I actually think that this is really important, because when you start shifting what materials you think are the unique ones for your service design practice, you may also shift the way you think about what service design is and what service is. So there are different constellations, I believe, of what is those unique materials of service design.
Can I pitch in with another professor answer? Because it's, I think one of the things, I mean, if you think about the essence of design, is very much the synthesis of many things, especially service design. You're integrating multiple things into what becomes a service offering and journey and experiences ultimately. But I think I don't think there are I think it's very hard to find a material that is unique to a service designer, but I think it's the combination that makes it service design. And that's really kind of a little bit of what Stefan was saying as well. It's like, which ones do you want to combine as your own skill set? What competences do you need to have to combine the right ones? And that creates this individuality that you have as a designer or as a service.
Good answer, Simon. Do we have one more question, maybe Robin or Brendan? I haven't kept track of how many questions we have here.
I think that's all from chat, but I had one. I'm interested in how this is for any of the authors, how you guys see your book being applied in practice. So, I teach service design here in Dallas as well, not professorially, as it were, but we focus a lot on practicum, right? The doing of the things, and here's a tool, use it. Here's a tool, use it. How do you anticipate the heady nature of your book and its content to then be rolled out to people in the field who are doing the work?
That's also a good question, of course. So parts of it, I mean, there are multiple parts of the book, right? So some of them are probably more, the part where I'm talking about rhizomatic structures, etc. That's maybe not necessarily super easy to apply. It may be inspiring and maybe challenges a bit of thinking, etc. While other parts of the book, like the actual material descriptions, they are, at least I see them as being generative in that sense, right? So they are probably more directly possible to apply to a project. And also some of the modeling we do in directly after the material descriptions, where we talk about what categories of material, etc. Those are probably also possible, and that is also possible to apply in the sense of trying to figure out what competences should we develop, what kinds of materials are we using, should we use other materials in order to crack open this way of working with our understanding of service. Do we need to hire someone that are good in a certain kind of material category, or etc. Right? So I think there are the mid part of the book is the one that is probably the closest and easiest to fit into being used in teaching, in practice, etc. While the rhizomatic structures and some of those other more analytic and more philosophical maybe chapters are maybe more difficult to apply.
Yeah, and we're a bit over time now, so I want to thank you, three of you, for the time you spent with us. I know it's late, so I really appreciate you joining us. Very enlightening and very new way to look at service design. We haven't seen anything like this, so I can recommend enough. If you cannot get the hard version of the book, get the ebook. We can definitely give the link again. Very, very understanding. It is both academic and also have a nice bridge into practical things you can use in your everyday work on service design. So I want to thank the three of you again for joining us from the Nordic countries. So thank you so much, Stefan, Johan, and Simon. This was a great book. I really enjoy reading it. It's a pretty quick read. So I really encourage you to get the book as soon as you can and dive into that. It is not at all the other service design books are more about frameworks and methodology and how to do things. This one is very much about challenging your thinking around, what can I use in order for me to get to that design? And sometimes it's a conversation, sometimes it's a culture shift, sometimes it's change management. So I definitely was very interested to see those immaterial, intangible things, which is a lot of what we do, to be honest with you. Like, if you look at a service design project, a lot of those things are depending on the thinking behind the decision. So thank you so much, Simon, Johan, and Stefan, for your time. I hope your book goes well and it becomes a staple in many schools in Europe and all over the world. And with that, thank you so much for all of you for joining us. We will probably have another session in May or June around setting up your own private large language models around service design AI. We had a talk a couple of weeks ago around that, but we're definitely going to teach you how easy and how simple it is to set up your own LLM for service design help. Once again, thank you, all of you. Have a wonderful night in Europe, and we will post this video online as early as tonight, maybe tomorrow. But we definitely want you to share this video, this book review with all your friends, because it's a really great book, very new way to look at service design for sure. Thank you so much for the authors.
Thank you so much.
Have a lovely evening. And
thank you, Greg. Thank you, Brandon.
You're welcome, Simon. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Johan.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.